let's return to those kitchens and rediscover those slow-cooked dinners. Some slow-cooker meals in the 1970s weren't about surviving the week. They were about feeling a little elevated without spending like it. Beef stroganoff was that kind of dish. It had the personality of a company dinner but the workload of a weekday. Chunks of beef went into the crock pot with onions and canned mushrooms. Nothing fancy, nothing hands-on. The low, steady heat coaxed out tenderness without supervision. Near the very end, a generous spoon of sour cream slipped in and turned the broth silky, turning an ordinary pot into something that felt like it came from a white tablecloth restaurant. Served over egg noodles, it looked like more effort than it really was. And that was the whole magic. For many households, this was the dish you brought out when you wanted dinner to feel like something more than fuel. When you wanted to remind yourself that even with bills, shifts, and tired nights, you could still sit down to something that tasted like a small reward. Not every cut in the butcher case was meant for company. Round steak was the kind of meat families bought when the paycheck had to stretch, not when guests were coming over. It was lean, stubborn, and cheap, which is exactly why the crockpot made sense for it. Before it ever touched the slow cooker, people beat it into submission with whatever was in reach. A rolling pin, the back of a spoon, even a jar. A dusting of flour helped it brown and thicken later. Then it disappeared under a blanket of tomatoes, onions, peppers, and celery inside the pot. The clock did the work nobody had time for. Hours later, what began as a tough economy cut had turned into something fork tender, swimming in a red gravy that clung to mashed potatoes or egg noodles. Church cookbooks passed this one around like quiet insurance against a bad month. It wasn't glamorous, and it never tried to be. But for the families who leaned on it, Swiss steak delivered exactly what they needed. A hot plate, a full stomach, and no guilt about the grocery bill. There was a certain kind of silence in a 1970s house that told you dinner was already taken care of. You could set your bag down, take off your coat, and that slow, rich smell of beef and vegetables would already be waiting in the hallway. Nobody hovered over a stove. The crock pot had been working since sunrise. A cheap chuck roast went in first, still stiff and cold from the fridge. Potatoes, carrots, onions, maybe celery were tucked around it like insulation. Some people poured in broth, others relied on nothing but condensation under the lid. Either way, by late afternoon, the meat had surrendered. It didn't slice, it collapsed. What made it feel so comforting wasn't just the food, it was the timing. You didn't stand there stirring or checking. Life happened. School, traffic, long shifts, while the pot did the watching for you. And when you came home, the house smelled like someone had been tending the meal all day, even if nobody had stepped foot in the kitchen since morning. For working families in the 1970s, that pot roast wasn't just dinner. It was proof that convenience didn't have to taste like compromise. Game days, church basements, block parties. Chili was the one crock-pot dish that could show up anywhere and belong. It wasn't delicate, it wasn't fussy, and nobody needed a recipe card to recognize it. Ground beef browned in a skillet first, then tipped into the slow cooker with canned tomatoes, kidney beans, and that little packet of chili seasoning that guaranteed the right balance without guesswork. As it simmered for hours, the sauce thickened, the spices mellowed, and the whole house picked up that deep, savory scent that made people lift lids even when they weren't supposed to. What made chili different from the other slow cooker staples was its personality. Every household had a rule: beans or no beans, cornbread or spaghetti, mild enough for kids or bold enough to make someone wipe their forehead. And leftover chili never stayed plain. It turned into chili dogs, Frito pie, nacho dip, lunches for tomorrow. Among the early crockpot classics, chili wasn't polite, but it was social. It fed a crowd, started arguments, and always disappeared. Which one showed up most often in your house? Pot roast, Swiss steak, stroganoff, or chili? Type the name of the dish you remember first. If there was ever a slow cooker meal that made a house feel like someone's grandmother still lived there, it was chicken and dumplings. Not the restaurant kind, the home kind, where a whole chicken sat in broth all day, turning the kitchen into a warm, humid cloud of comfort. Nothing about it was fancy. The chicken went in whole, sometimes with nothing more than salt, pepper, and a bay leaf. Hours later, the meat surrendered from the bone without being asked. Near dinner time, biscuit dough, torn straight from a tube or pinched from scratch, was dropped in to puff and soak up flavor. A can of cream of chicken soup or a splash of milk often finished the pot, turning it thick and spoon soft. For people who grew up with this dish, it wasn't just food. It was a reminder that shortcuts didn't have to erase heritage. The Crockpot made it possible to bring a Sunday dish to the table on a weeknight without standing over a stove or stirring anything but memories. This was the kind of dinner that proved two corporations could change the way America ate without ever stepping into a kitchen. Rival made the pot. Campbell's made the shortcut. Families made the habit. Pork chops, not thick and premium, just whatever the budget allowed, were laid into the Crockpot and drowned under a can of cream of mushroom soup. No browning, no measuring, no technique. By the time evening rolled around, the chops were so soft they barely held shape, and the sauce had turned into a gravy that tasted far richer than the ingredients deserved. This wasn't a recipe people bragged about. It was one they relied on. You could put it together half awake before work and still come home to something that tasted slow and careful. In kitchens painted avocado green and decorated with magnetic notepads, this dish became a quiet weeknight standard. Not impressive, not expensive, just done. Oven meatloaf had a way of betraying you. Cracked on top, dry in the middle, overcooked by the time everyone sat down. The slow cooker changed its personality entirely. Inside that moist, sealed space, meatloaf didn't shrink and harden. It stayed soft from edge to center. Ground beef was stretched with oats or crushed crackers to save money, then shaped into an oval that fit the stoneware. Potatoes or carrots were sometimes tucked around the sides so the whole meal finished together. A ketchup glaze, sometimes just Heinz straight from the bottle, sometimes mixed with brown sugar and mustard, went on top for the final hour, turning sticky and sweet under the steam. Nobody made meatloaf to impress company. It existed for a different purpose, to feed a family predictably, cheaply, and without drama. The Crockpot did that better than the oven ever could, making this old standby feel dependable again in a decade that demanded thrift. You didn't make ham and bean soup because you were feeling fancy. You made it because there was a ham bone left, and you were not about to waste it. That was how kitchens worked before abundance and disposability set in. Nothing with flavor got thrown out. Dry beans, the kind that used to intimidate people because they required soaking and watching, became effortless in a slow cooker. You just dumped them in with onions, carrots, celery, the leftover ham bone, maybe a bay leaf, and walked out the door. No babysitting, no boiling over, no checking. By the time you got home, what started as water and scraps had turned thick, smoky, and substantial enough to feed a family twice. What made this dish feel clever wasn't just thrift, it was transformation. It took ingredients that didn't look like a meal and turned them into something warm and filling without any additional cost or effort. And in a decade when grocery prices climbed and paychecks didn't, that kind of quiet victory mattered. Some people remember the soup itself. Others remember what came with it. Cornbread on the side, cracked pepper on top, or the pride of knowing you stretched one ham into 3 different dinners. In homes that learned to survive without waste, this wasn't poor food. It was proof that nothing useful was foolishly thrown away. Some slow cooker dinners were made for comfort, but sloppy joes were made for chaos. The chaos of kids running in and out, ball practice, homework, late shifts, and nobody eating at the same time. This was the meal that allowed dinner to wait without punishment. Ground beef was browned ahead of time, then dropped into the crock pot with a sweet, tangy sauce. Sometimes homemade, often straight from a can of manwich with a little brown sugar or mustard stirred in. The longer it sat, the thicker and deeper the flavor grew. A pile of soft hamburger buns nearby turned it into an assembly line that worked for any schedule. You could eat at 5 o'clock, someone else at 6:30, someone else at 8 o'clock. And nobody felt like they were eating leftovers. Magazines sold this meal with pictures of smiling children and calm mothers, but the truth is, sloppy joes were survival. Cheap, filling, forgiving, and kid-approved. They fed after-school hunger, teenage appetites, unannounced guests, and the kind of nights where everyone walked in the door at a different hour. In a decade when evenings were no longer slow or synchronized, sloppy joes gave families permission to eat in shifts, without guilt, without waste, and without losing that feeling that the house was still, somehow, eating the same dinner together. If chili was the social food for casual crowds, Swedish meatballs were the slow cooker's answer to "company is coming." They didn't look homemade. They looked prepared, intentional, almost elegant for something that required so little work. Frozen meatballs went straight into the crock pot with broth or canned gravy, sometimes both. Hours later, a spoonful of sour cream stirred in at the end transformed the sauce from brown and thin to silky and rich. Toothpicks came out, and suddenly the slow cooker wasn't just a weeknight tool, but it was a serving dish. These meatballs lived on holiday tables, office parties, baby showers, and church receptions. They stayed warm without attention, they never dried out, and nobody minded coming back for seconds. In a decade that taught people to entertain without standing in the kitchen all evening, Swedish meatballs fit the moment perfectly. Polite, creamy, and always gone by the end of the night. If this video is bringing back real memories for you, tap that hype button and let YouTube know this era still matters. In the Midwest, beef and noodles was less of a recipe and more of a social inheritance. It showed up at church suppers, harvest dinners, and fundraisers. The kind of meal designed to feed a lot of people without anyone going hungry. Chunks of beef simmered all day in broth until the liquid turned cloudy and savory. The real moment came near the end, when wide egg noodles were dropped in and allowed to cook right in the pot. Their starch thickened the broth into something between a stew and a gravy. Heavy, comforting, and built for deep bowls and big spoons. Some cooks added peas or canned mushrooms to make the pot stretch even further. Unlike chili or stroganoff, this dish didn't aim for flair, it aimed for fullness. It was built for cold weather, long tables, and the kind of nights when nobody left the house until every last ladle was gone. Not every crockpot meal looked pretty, but stuffed peppers did. They came out of that slow cooker standing like little green towers, glossy and soft, filled with whatever a family could afford. Usually ground beef, uncooked minute rice, tomato sauce, and a pinch of Italian seasoning. It was one of the few slow cooker dinners you could set directly on the table without apology. What made this dish feel special wasn't the ingredients. They were pantry staples. It was the presentation. Even in an avocado green kitchen with laminate counters and a Tupperware bread bin, stuffed peppers looked like a real meal. Department stores knew it too. Sears and JCPenney sometimes demonstrated crockpots with stuffed peppers because they drew crowds. People could see the finish before tasting it. As the peppers slowly collapsed inward, the rice inside swelled with sauce and juice until the filling became one cohesive bite. They didn't need carving, they yielded. And unlike casseroles or stews, everyone got their own individual portion, something that made weeknight dinners feel a little more formal without adding any work. In a time when shortcut ingredients were becoming normal, stuffed peppers offered the illusion of effort, proof that a dinner could look thoughtful even when the morning prep took less than 5 minutes. Before the slow cooker, this was a once-a-year project. A pot watched all day for St. Patrick's Day or a Sunday gathering. The crockpot turned it into a weeknight possibility. A brisket went in first, spice packet dumped over the top, then wedges of cabbage, potatoes, and carrots packed in around it. Left alone for hours, the brisket relaxed the way only low heat can, slicing into tender slabs instead of fighting the knife. The vegetables absorbed the salty, spiced broth until they tasted like part of the meat itself. And because the slow cooker didn't boil anything to death, nothing fell apart before dinner. Once this dish became hands-off, it slipped out of holiday status and into rotation, especially in households that stretched leftovers into sandwiches or hash. Tradition survived not because people had more time, but because the slow cooker made it possible with less. Did corned beef and cabbage ever show up in your house outside of St. Patrick's Day? Or was it only a holiday thing for you? In some parts of America, especially Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the Midwest, pork and sauerkraut on New Year's Day wasn't a choice. It was insurance. Pork meant progress, a pig roots forward, never backward. And long strands of kraut were said to bring long fortune. The slow cooker made sure no one missed the tradition just because modern life got busier. A pork roast went into the crock pot with canned sauerkraut, sometimes an apple or a bit of brown sugar to soften the edge. By the time the day's errands or church services were over, the meat pulled apart easily and the kraut had mellowed into something both tangy and warm. No pot had to be watched. No timing had to be perfect. What kept this dish alive wasn't just superstition, it was convenience meeting heritage. Families who might have skipped the tradition because they didn't have hours to babysit a stove could now keep it with almost no effort. And for many who grew up in those households, the smell of pork and kraut simmering isn't just food memory. It's the smell of the first day of the year. Some meals fed the body. This one promised the future. If there was a starter recipe for new brides, first apartments, or anyone unsure in the kitchen, this was it. Chicken and rice casserole in the slow cooker was foolproof by design. You almost had to try to mess it up. Uncle Ben's converted rice was poured into the bottom, raw chicken went on top, then a can of cream soup, chicken, celery, or mushroom, plus a splash of water or broth. No browning, no chopping, no whisking. By dinner time, the rice had swollen with flavor from the chicken, and the soup had turned into a creamy blanket that tied the whole pot together. This wasn't a show-off dish, it was a confidence-building one. PTA cookbooks and Junior League collections put it on page 1 for a reason. It worked every time, it stretched $1, and it didn't demand skill or supervision. In a decade when more women were working outside the home and still expected to put dinner on the table, recipes like this didn't just feed people. They kept new cooks from burning out. It tasted simple. The relief behind it was bigger than the food. For a lot of Americans, Salisbury steak carried the memory of TV dinners. The foil tray, the divided compartments, the little brownie that never baked right. But when the same idea moved into a slow cooker, it lost its frozen aisle reputation and became real food again. Ground beef was shaped into thick oval patties and nestled into the crock pot with canned mushrooms and brown gravy. No searing, no preheating, just time and steam doing the work the oven never did well. Hours later, the patties weren't dry or crusted like the frozen ones. They were soft, soaked with sauce, and closer to restaurant meat than cafeteria nostalgia. People didn't make Salisbury steak because they were trying to impress anyone. They made it because it delivered the feeling of a proper dinner on nights when money and energy were limited. Served over mashed potatoes or egg noodles, it took something associated with convenience foods and gave it dignity again. In the slow cooker era, Salisbury steak proved a simple truth of the 1970s kitchen. The same ingredients could feel cheap or comforting depending on how they were treated. And the crock pot was the difference. Before canned soup became the default, there was a version that tasted like someone had stayed home to make it. The slow cooker made that possible again for families who were gone all day. A whole chicken went into the pot with carrots, celery, onion, maybe a bay leaf. Nothing complicated. Hours later, the meat slid off the bone and the broth turned golden without anyone skimming or stirring. The key was patience with the noodles. They didn't go in until the very end, just long enough to soften without dissolving. That one step separated real soup from the soggy canned kind people had lived on for convenience. The first scoop from the pot carried that quiet pride. This tasted like care, not compromise. For many, chicken noodle soup wasn't just a meal. It was medicine, weather insurance, and childhood security in a bowl. It showed up when someone was sick, when the house felt cold, when money was tight, or when comfort mattered more than creativity. The crockpot didn't invent the soup, it preserved the ritual. It made it possible to serve something old-fashioned in a new-paced world without losing what made it feel like home. Some slow cooker dishes became famous not because of grandmothers, but because of grocery aisles. Beef tips and gravy was one of those recipes born from a packet. Specifically, the blue and silver envelope of Lipton onion soup mix that sat in nearly every pantry by the mid-1970s. Stew meat or cubed round steak went into the crock pot with water or broth and a sprinkle from that packet. Sometimes mushrooms or onions were added, but the real star was thyme. As the hours passed, the seasoning dissolved and thickened, turning cheap beef and liquid into a glossy, savory gravy that clung to every bite. Poured over mashed potatoes, rice, or egg noodles, it tasted richer than its ingredients justified. Lipton didn't just sell a product, it sold reassurance. Magazine ads promised company-worthy flavor from a shortcut, and recipe cards slipped into grocery bags made sure households tried it at least once. For many, this was the moment they realized the slow cooker could produce something that tasted prepared on purpose, not improvised on a budget. It wasn't the meat that made this dish memorable. It was the feeling of getting a restaurant-style dinner out of 3 motions, and a packet you could grab with your eyes closed. Before countertop smokers and backyard pellet grills, most families had only 2 ways to get real pulled pork: drive to a barbecue joint, or spend all day tending a hot pit. The slow cooker offered a third option, one that didn't require fire, supervision, or good weather. A pork shoulder went in whole, sometimes with just a bottle of BBQ sauce, sometimes with cola or apple cider vinegar added for depth. The lid went on, and the house went quiet. By late afternoon, the meat shredded with nothing more than 2 forks, soaking up whatever sauce it sat in. Piled onto soft buns, it delivered the taste of a cookout without smoke, sweat, or sunlight. This dish became the centerpiece for graduation parties, block gatherings, church socials, even weeknight dinners when a crowd needed feeding. The crock-pot didn't try to mimic a smoker, and it offered an alternative. The same payoff, none of the labor. For families who lived in apartments, cold weather states, or houses without a grill, slow cooker pulled pork felt like cheating in the best possible way. Like getting something you weren't supposed to have on a Wednesday. No dish from the first slow cooker boom explains the 1970s better than this one. Sweet grape jelly and Heinz chili sauce sound like a prank on paper, yet in a crock pot they turned into the unofficial party food of the decade. Frozen meatballs went in, the 2 jars were poured over, and the pot was left alone until the glaze turned glossy and thick. These meatballs didn't belong to any nationality or tradition. They belonged to gatherings. They appeared at wedding showers, office potlucks, open houses, and Christmas parties. You didn't plate them, you served them right from the crock pot with toothpicks. People kept returning not because they were elegant, but because they were impossible to stop eating. The recipe spread the old-fashioned way. Handwritten cards tucked into PTA bulletins, clipped magazine pages taped to fridge doors, neighbors copying it over the phone. It wasn't ironic or kitschy at the time. It was loved without apology. And for many people, one bite of that sweet, tangy glaze is enough to bring back an entire room full of laughter, polyester, and folding tables covered in Pyrex. Some dishes define a cuisine. This one defined a decade of gatherings. Have you ever tasted those grape jelly party meatballs? And be honest, did you go back for seconds? There was something unmistakably weeknight 1970s about a crock of beef stew working in the background while the house sat empty. Not the glossy restaurant kind. The home kind, with big, uneven chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, onions, and maybe a bay leaf somebody tossed in without measuring. It wasn't elegant, but the smell that filled the air by late afternoon didn't need decorating. The slow cooker did what the stovetop never could. It turned time into an ingredient. Tough beef loosened its grip and melted into the broth. The vegetables softened without collapsing, and the gravy thickened itself while nobody watched. You didn't check it, you didn't stir it. You trusted it. Beef stew in a crock pot wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about coming home to something warm that asked nothing from you except a bowl and a spoon. In an era of rising prices and long commutes, this was the kind of meal that stretched modest ingredients into security. The edible reassurance that no matter how loud the world outside got, dinner would be waiting. Split pea and ham soup was one of those meals that proved the slow cooker could turn scraps into something that felt intentional. It usually started with the ham bone left from Sunday dinner, still clinging to bits of meat that weren't worth carving but were far too valuable to throw away in a 1970s kitchen. Dried split peas went in without soaking, a miracle to anyone who grew up watching beans on the stove all day. Along with carrots, onions, celery, a bay leaf, maybe a shake of black pepper, the whole pot was left alone until the peas surrendered and the broth thickened into something closer to a meal than a soup. By evening, the ham bone had given up everything it had, leaving behind smoky depth and small pieces of meat that surfaced with every ladle. What made this dish special wasn't its recipe, it was the philosophy behind it. Nothing wasted. Nothing rushed. Nothing fancy, yet nothing accidental. In a decade when groceries cost more than people like to admit, split pea and ham soup turned leftovers into pride, not compromise. For many families, this wasn't poor food. It was the taste of a house that refused to waste what it had. Finally, goulash was one of those dishes that made the slow cooker feel a little worldly without asking for anything exotic. Even in ordinary American kitchens with avocado green appliances and formica tables, the smell of paprika, beef, and onions simmering all day gave the house a hint of something European. Even if the recipe came from a church bulletin instead of Budapest, beef cubes went in first along with sliced onions that collapsed into sweetness under the low heat. Paprika, often the cheap red tin from the supermarket, not the fancy imported kind, stained the broth a deep brick color. A little tomato, maybe some garlic, maybe bell peppers depending on who made it, and then the lid went on. Hours later, the meat lost all resistance and the sauce turned thick enough to cling to noodles or mashed potatoes without apology. Unlike pot roast or stew, goulash carried a small sense of occasion. It wasn't a poverty dish and it wasn't a party tray. It sat in the comfortable middle. The kind of meal you made when you wanted dinner to feel a bit different, without costing more or working harder. The slow cooker made that kind of ambition possible on an ordinary weekday. For households discovering new flavors in the 1970s with old kitchens together, one memory at a time. See why you all in the upcoming videos.